The morning Harlan Beckett handed each of his 3 sons an envelope containing $40 and a bus pass. Not one of them said thank you. That wasn't entirely surprising. They were his sons, after all. Raised in a house where the heat never went out, where the fridge was always stocked, where the word budget existed only in quarterly reports that other people prepared. Harlan had built Beckett infrastructure from a single bulldozer and a borrowed line of credit into one of the largest civil engineering firms west of Toronto. He had done it by waking before sunrise and going to bed after midnight for 15 years straight. His sons had done it by being born. The oldest, Conrad, was 34. He managed the Calgary office, or rather, he occupied it. He had his father's jaw and his mother's charm, and he had learned early that both could open doors that competence alone might not. Conrad wore tailored shirts and drove a truck that cost more than some people's houses, and when Harlan handed him the envelope that Tuesday morning, Conrad looked at it the way a man looks at a parking ticket. Inconvenient. Temporary. Someone else's problem, eventually. The middle son, Fletcher, was 31. He had never quite decided what he wanted to be, so he had defaulted to being available, present at every family dinner, enthusiastic at every company meeting, but somehow never quite responsible for anything that required sustained effort. Fletcher was likable. That was the word everyone used. Harlan had long since stopped finding it a compliment. The youngest was Milo, 28, quiet, and the only one of the 3 who had ever openly disagreed with his father. 3 years ago, Milo had turned down a position at Beckett Infrastructure to take a job at a small environmental consulting firm in Kelowna. Harlan had not spoken to him for 4 months after that. They had since reached a kind of détente, but it was the détente of 2 countries that had agreed not to shoot at each other rather than the peace of people who actually understood one another. All 3 of them had come to Edmonton for the long weekend. Harlan had called it a family meeting. He had asked them to clear their schedules. He had not told them what it was about, because he knew if he had, at least 2 of them would have found reasons not to come. They sat in the living room of the house he had built on the river valley. Conrad, with his legs crossed and one arm draped over the back of the couch, Fletcher leaning forward on his knees the way he always did when he was trying to look engaged, Milo on the chair near the window, watching the yard. Harlan set the envelopes on the coffee table. 7 days, he said, starting tomorrow morning. Each of you takes what's in that envelope and nothing else. No credit cards, no calling the office, no staying with friends. You figure out how to eat, where to sleep, how to get through a week in this city with what's in front of you. Conrad stared at him. Dad, $40, Harlan said, and a 7-day transit pass. Fletcher picked up his envelope and held it. Is this some kind of what is this? It's what I said it is. Conrad laughed once, short and sharp. You're serious. I'm always serious, Dad. I have a site review in Calgary on Thursday. I can't just. I've already spoken to Meredith. She'll handle it. The look on Conrad's face shifted. The laugh was gone. Something harder replaced it. Something that looked almost like the first genuine emotion Harlan had seen from his oldest son in years, even if that emotion was anger. You went to my assistant before you told me? I wasn't sure you'd agree. I don't agree. You're not required to. Harlan sat down in the chair across from them. But if you walk out that door with your credit card instead of that envelope, you can consider yourself removed from the succession plan. Both of you. He looked at Fletcher when he said it too. Fletcher was already nodding slowly, the way he nodded when he was computing options. Milo, near the window, had not said anything yet. He was watching his father with an expression Harlan couldn't quite read. Not angry, not amused, something more careful than either. I'm not part of the succession plan, Milo said. No, Harlan said. You're not. You don't have to participate. Milo was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Okay. Conrad turned to look at his younger brother. Okay, what? Okay, I'll do it. Milo picked up one of the envelopes. I was going to drive back to Kelowna tomorrow anyway. This is fine. This is not fine, Conrad said, turning back to his father. This is Dad. I'm a 34-year-old man. I'm not doing a school project. No, Harlan said. You're not. You're doing something harder. The first 2 days, Conrad managed on pride alone. He knew Edmonton. He had grown up here, knew which neighborhoods were which, knew the grid of the streets the way you know the layout of a house you've lived in since childhood. He checked into the cheapest motel he could find near White Avenue. $38 a night, which left him $2 after the first night, and the transit pass and nothing else. He ate at a church supper on the second evening. He told himself it was research. He told himself he was observing. He sat at a long folding table beside a man named Gerald, who had been out of work for 3 months, and a teenager who didn't speak much and ate with the focused intensity of someone who was genuinely hungry. Conrad ate 2 plates of shepherd's pie and felt something he didn't have a clean word for. Shame was part of it. But it wasn't just shame. It was something more disorienting. The specific feeling of sitting in a room where your name means nothing, where no one is going to comp your meal or upgrade your room or move a meeting because of who your father is. He had not felt that before. He was not sure he had ever understood, until that evening, that he had never felt it. On the 3rd day, he ran out of money entirely. He stood outside a Tim Hortons on 109th Street and counted the change in his jacket pocket. $4.60. He had skipped breakfast. He had not slept well on the motel mattress, which had a spring that pressed against his lower back every time he rolled over. He was wearing the same shirt he'd arrived in, because he hadn't thought to pack anything, before his father had essentially marched all 3 of them out of the house with their envelopes. A woman walked past him and dropped a loonie in the paper cup of a man sitting against the wall nearby. Conrad watched the transaction. The man said thank you without looking up. The woman didn't slow down. Conrad thought about calling Meredith. He thought about it for a long time, standing on that sidewalk. He knew she would help him. She would find a way to get him a hotel room or a cash advance on his expense account, and she would do it without asking questions because that was what she'd always done. He had never once thought about what that cost her. He didn't call. Instead, he walked 4 blocks to a day labor office he'd noticed from the bus window the day before. He filled out the paperwork with the pen the receptionist lent him and got a cash job the next morning. Traffic flagging on a road crew out near the Henday, standing in the cold with an orange vest and a stop-slow sign for 9 hours. He made $94. His feet hurt in a way they had never hurt before. His lower back, already aggravated by the mattress, was broadcasting a steady, insistent pain by hour 6. He bought groceries at the Save-On his way back. Bread, peanut butter, a bag of apples, instant oatmeal. He stood in the checkout line and watched the total climb and pulled items back out of his basket. The orange juice first, then the yogurt, until the number matched what was in his hand. He did not feel like a man being tested. He felt like a man learning for the first time the actual dimensions of the world he had been moving through without ever measuring. Fletcher's version of the week was different. Fletcher had a gift for finding people who wanted to help him, and he deployed this gift immediately. By the end of the first day, he had charmed his way into a spare room at the apartment of a woman he'd met at a coffee shop. Not a romantic arrangement, just a couch, but a warm one, and had picked up a few shifts at a food truck through a contact he'd made in conversation by the end of the second. He was likable. That was still true. And in a week with $40 and no safety net, likable turned out to be a genuine resource. People gave Fletcher things: coffee, shifts, information, a pair of work gloves when his hands got cold. He was grateful in the easy, reflexive way of someone who had always received generosity, without thinking much about where it came from or what it meant. Midweek, something happened that Fletcher hadn't anticipated. He was working the food truck. Falafel wraps, mostly, and a surprisingly good za'atar flatbread, when a family came to the window. A mother, 2 kids, and a grandmother who moved slowly and needed the younger woman's arm to steady herself. The kids pressed their faces to the counter. The mother counted coins. She was short, not by much. $4, maybe $5. She looked at the menu again, then at her kids, and Fletcher watched her do a kind of quiet arithmetic that had nothing to do with math. He covered it. He did it before he thought about it. Said the total was wrong, said the system had glitched, said don't worry about it. The mother looked at him for a moment. She knew. He knew she knew. She said, "Thank you," in a voice that was tired and genuine, and Fletcher felt something go sideways in his chest. That night, lying on the couch with his phone face down, he did something he hadn't done in years. He sat with a feeling instead of deflecting it. He thought about the woman's face, and about all the invisible arithmetic that other people were doing all the time, while he was busy being charming and convenient and pleasantly undefined. He thought about his father's face when he'd handed them the envelopes. He had always assumed the test was about survival. In the food truck, watching the family walk away, he began to suspect it was about something else entirely. Milo spent the first night on the north side, in a neighborhood he'd never had much reason to visit growing up. He found a room at a shared house through a notice board at a library. $12 a night, shared bathroom, kitchen access. The man who ran the house was named Bernard, 70s, retired millwright, kept the place immaculately clean and charged cash only. He made coffee every morning at 6:30 and left it on the counter for whoever was up. He did not ask questions. Milo liked him immediately. His week was not comfortable, but it was not chaotic either. He had lived lean before. Not this lean, but the years in Kelowna before his firm had stabilized had included some months where the math was tight. He knew how to portion things, how to plan a week of meals from a single grocery run, how to occupy himself without spending money. What he hadn't expected was the neighborhood itself. He walked a lot. He had always been a walker. It was the thing he had in common with his father, though neither of them had ever said so. He walked along the river, through the industrial stretch near the rail yards, through a residential area where the houses were small and the yards were full of garden beds, folded lawn chairs, kids' bikes left out overnight. The small evidence of lives lived close to the surface of things. On the third day, he found himself helping Bernard patch a section of fence that had been damaged in a windstorm the week before. They worked for most of the afternoon, Bernard handing him boards and holding the level, and they talked. Not about anything consequential, about wood grain and weather patterns, and the way the city had changed since Bernard had first come to Edmonton in 1987. Milo listened more than he spoke. He had always been better at listening. At some point, Bernard said, without preamble, "You don't look like someone who needs to be here." Milo considered this. "My father wanted us to understand something," he said. Bernard straightened up and looked at him. "What's he want you to understand?" "I think." Milo paused, fitting a board against the post. "I think he wants my brothers to understand it. I already know the shape of it." "What shape is that?" Milo knocked the nail in with 2 clean strokes. "That most people don't have a floor." Bernard looked at him for a long moment. Then he nodded and handed him another board. That evening, Milo sat on the back steps of the house with a cup of Bernard's coffee and called his father. Not to check in, not to report, just to talk. Harland answered on the second ring, which surprised Milo. His father was not a man who answered quickly, as a general rule. He seemed to believe that urgency was a negotiating disadvantage. "You doing all right?" Harland asked. "Yeah," Milo said. "I'm all right." He looked at the yard, a fence line, a dry garden bed, a birch tree that had dropped half its leaves. "Dad, why did you include me in this?" Silence for a moment. Then, "Because I wasn't sure you'd let me if I asked directly." "Let you, what?" "Tell you that I know I got it wrong." Harland's voice was level, but there was something underneath it. Not quite an apology, not quite emotion, something in between that was more honest than either. "Not with the money. With the early part. The part before the money existed." Milo said nothing. "I was building something," his father said. "I know that's not an excuse. I'm not offering it as one. I'm telling you the shape of it. From where I was standing. I know the shape of it," Milo said. "I know you do." A pause. "That's why I asked you to come." On the 7th evening, Harland sat alone in the kitchen and waited. He had not slept well all week. He was 61 years old, and he had made a decision that could reasonably be described as reckless. And the difference between a man who makes reckless decisions and one who makes bold ones is mostly whether they work out. He had not known if this would work out. He still didn't. Conrad came back first. He came in through the back door, which he had never done in his life. He set his transit pass on the counter and sat down at the kitchen table and looked at his father across the distance of the room. "I worked a flagging job," he said. Harland nodded. "I ate at a church supper. I slept on a motel mattress that should have been thrown out in 2015. Conrad folded his hands on the table. "I'm not going to sit here and tell you it changed my whole outlook on life, Dad. I'm not going to perform that for you. I'm not asking you to, but..." Conrad stopped. He looked at his hands. "I watched a woman count coins for groceries. I counted them myself, and it's not what I expected it to feel like. What did you expect?" "I expected to be inconvenienced." Conrad looked up. "I didn't expect to feel ashamed of myself, not of being poor, of being me, of who I've been." He paused. "I don't know what to do with that yet." "You don't have to know yet," Harland said. "Knowing it exists is enough for now." Fletcher arrived an hour later. He came in talking, the way Fletcher always came in, narrating the week with anecdotes and observations, and the particular energy of a man who processed things by speaking them aloud. But partway through the story about the food truck, he stopped. And he looked at his father, and something in the performance fell away. "There was a woman," Fletcher said, "with kids, and I..." He shook his head. "I've spent my whole life making people feel good, and I've never once thought about whether I was making anything better. There's a difference." He looked almost surprised by his own sentence. "I didn't know there was a difference until this week." Harland looked at his middle son for a long moment. "There is," he said. "There's a very large difference." Milo came in last, just after 9, and he sat down at the table and accepted the coffee Harland put in front of him, and they were quiet for a while. Not uncomfortably, the way they had sometimes been, but the quietness of two people who have already said the hard things and have arrived for the moment at something simpler. "How'd they do?" Milo asked. Harland looked at his oldest 2 sons. Conrad was staring at the surface of the table. Fletcher was turning his cup in his hands. "Better than I expected," Harland said. "Different than I expected." "That's usually what happens," Milo said. "When you remove the floor." Conrad looked up at that. He looked at his youngest brother, looked at him maybe, in a way that he hadn't in a long time, not with the easy dismissal of an older sibling, not with the comfortable condescension that had calcified between them over the years. With something more like curiosity, maybe even something like respect. "You knew," Conrad said. "You already knew what this was going to be like." "Not the details," Milo said, "but the shape of it." "How?" Milo said chose to live in it. "Not the hard version. I'm not going to pretend I've suffered. But close enough to know the difference between having a floor and not having one." Fletcher said quietly, "Why didn't you ever tell us that? What it was like?" "I tried once," Milo said. "You were in the middle of telling a story about a ski trip." Fletcher looked like he'd been gently struck. He didn't argue. Later, when the kitchen had gone quiet again, and his sons had gone to sleep, Conrad in his old room, Fletcher on the couch by choice this time, saying the motel had recalibrated his relationship with furniture, Milo in the small room at the end of the hall. Harland stood at the kitchen window and looked out at the river valley in the dark. He had built this house to last. He had specified the foundation himself, had argued with the contractor about the depth of the pilings, had insisted on materials the budget hadn't comfortably allowed because he knew, from 15 years of moving earth for a living, that the thing you couldn't see was the thing that mattered most. He had not applied that logic to his children until it was almost too late. Almost. That was the word he was holding. Almost. Not too late. There was still time. Not infinite time. He was 61 and not naive about what that meant, but enough. Enough for Conrad to sit with his shame long enough to let it change something. Enough for Fletcher to learn the difference between performance and presence. Enough for Milo to stop being a stranger at his own family's table. He was not a sentimental man. He had never been the kind of father who said the right thing at the right moment, who appeared in doorways with wisdom prepared. He was the kind who showed up early and stayed late and expected others to do the same. And he had confused that with love for a very long time. But love and expectation are not the same thing. He knew that now. He had known it for a while, if he was honest, but knowing something and doing something about it were not the same thing either. The river was dark below. The lights of the city made a low, soft glow above the trees. He had handed his sons $40 and a bus pass, and asked them to find out who they were without his name to carry them. 2 of them had found something they didn't expect. 1 of them had already known, and had come anyway. Because Harland had asked, and because quietly, underneath the 4 months of silence and the careful détente and all the years of not quite knowing how to be in the same room as each other, Milo had never actually stopped showing up. Harland thought about the call, the back steps, the birch tree, the fence boards, the shape of it. He turned off the kitchen light and went to bed, and for the first time in a week, he slept without waking.